great pleasure to be here at the Carter-Jenkins Center and to talk about W. Ernest Freud, the life and work of the Fort Da baby, because in many respects it's a returning full circle. I was invited by W. Ernest Freud to write his biography back in 2001, and at that time he told me that if I was going to write his biography, which is what he wanted me to do, I needed to talk to Umberto Nachera, his good buddy for many, many years. And so as I began work on this, I called Dr. Nachera while I was still in Caracas, Venezuela, and we began to have lengthy conversations about W. Ernest Freud, Anna Freud, the Hampstead Clinic, and all of the politics of Nazi Germany, communist Cuba, and supposedly socialist Venezuela. And we saw how psychoanalysis has always existed, sometimes suffered and sometimes needed to go into exile from totalitarian regimes. In the course of my conversations with Dr. Nachera, I learned a great deal about W. Ernest Freud and Anna Freud, as I mentioned, the clinic, but also about Dr. Nachera. And when I was finished, I asked Dr. Nachera if he would read the manuscript, which at that time was probably about literally 1,000 pages. He readily agreed and said he would give me a direct, honest critique. I received his critique, and he cut it up here, cut it up there, told me this was wrong, that was different. He didn't see it this way, that way. I wrote him back saying, I don't know what I did to deserve such a magnificent critique. It was absolutely invaluable. It changed the tone and some of the facts of the biography immeasurably, and then it was rather natural to, when it was finished, invite Dr. Nachera to write the foreword, which he graciously did. So today I'm really glad to be here and be able to talk about W. Ernest Freud, the life and work of the Fort Da baby. There is perhaps no case, no dream, no observation of Freud's that has received more commentaries and alternative interpretations than his observation of his 18-month-old of the 18-month-old boy playing with the wooden reel on the end of a string. When his mother would leave their apartment, the boy would repeatedly throw this wooden reel with a string tied to it into a curtained cot while holding the other end of the string in his hand. In this way, the reel disappeared into the cot, and as he did, he said, "Oh," which was understood to mean fort, which is German for gone. And when he pulled on the string and the reel reappeared, he said, "Da," there. And from that observation, Freud elaborated his ideas on turning passive into active and on the nature of the repetition compulsion. What is less known, but certainly no secret, is that the little boy was Freud's oldest grandchild, Ernst, and his only grandchild who was to become a psychoanalyst. Most psychoanalysts mark the beginning of their psychoanalytic training from the time they first read The Interpretation of Dreams, went into analysis, or attended a seminar led by a Freudian. When I asked W. Ernest Freud when his psychoanalytic training began, he said simply, "In my mother's belly." W. Ernest Freud was born Ernst Wolfgang Halberstadt on March 11, 1914 in Hamburg, Germany, when Carl Jung was still president of the IPA and Otto Rank still in Freud's inner circle. Ernst was the son of Sigmund Freud's second daughter, Sophie, and Max Halberstadt. but he changed his name to W. Ernest Freud after the Second World War because, one, he felt very close, he felt the name W. Ernest Freud, he felt the name Ernst Wolfgang Halberstadt sounded too German for post-war England, and also because he always felt closer to the Freud side of the family. Ernst's mother, Sophie Freud, was an attractive young woman who was bright enough to know her father's work and yet more identified with the feminine roles of her mother. Max Halberstadt was a portrait photographer in Hamburg, Germany, and is responsible for several of the most recognizable portraits of Freud. Shortly after Max and Sophie's marriage, on January 14, 1913, Sophie became pregnant. When Ernst was born, Sigmund Freud celebrated the occasion with a letter to Sandor Ferenczi. Quote, "Dear friend, tonight at 3 o'clock in the morning, a little boy, my first grandchild. Very strange, an oldish feeling. Respect for the wonders of sexuality. Sophie is very well, and she even said over the telephone, it wasn't so bad." In the years to come, in spite of the hardships created by the First World War, Grandpa Sigmund and little Ernst visited one another in Hamburg and in Vienna. In mid-September 1915, while visiting Ernst in Hamburg, Freud observed something that was destined to contribute to the reshaping of psychoanalytic theory. He observed something beyond the pleasure principle, something that had implications for the compulsions to repeat, the turning of passive into active, the management of loss and renunciation of instinct. He observed little Ernst's playful game of Fort Da, his games of disappearance and return, which Freud described in detail in his book Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Freud also described some of Ernst's games of disappearance and return in the 1919 version of the Interpretation of Dreams. Also included were 2 of Ernst's dreams and a free association to his little grandson Ernst from one of Freud's own dreams. And so a lot of people think of it's all wrapped up in the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, but it was in 1919. Freud was still observing and recording some of his, making child observations of this grandson. Subsequently, Ernst's game of Fort Da has been reinterpreted or elaborated by Melanie Klein, Jacques Lacan, Jacques Derrida, Donald Winnicott, Erik Erikson, Harold Bloom, Jean Piaget, Hermione Hook-Helmuth, and many more. Interestingly enough, in Ernst's first years, his mother kept a baby diary in which she included additional observations which we can now recognize as elaborations of the themes of disappearance and return. In 1916, Max Halberstadt, a German soldier in the First World War, returned home from the long and bloody battle at Verdun in northeastern France with a shrapnel wound to the back of the head. He recuperated at home and was then transferred to Mecklenburg-Schwerin, where he instructed German pilots in aerial photography and took aerial photographs of the warfront from open cockpit biplanes. Ernst remembered the First World War as a time of matrimonial bliss, that's his words, in love with his mother while his father was away at war. And his father's return from the warfront was anything but a happy occasion. In fact, he saw his father as an intruder and would sometimes throw his toys away, saying, "Go back to the front." Thus, he experienced his father as also disappearing and returning. Ernst described his relationship to his mother and father as his first Oedipal trauma, a point we will come back to shortly. In 1918, Ernst's mother told him a baby would be coming soon. Hearing the news, Ernst developed the idea that he was in fact the one that was pregnant, and that the baby would come out of him. On December 18th, 1918, Ernst's little brother Heinerli was born. He was a beautiful little boy, and his appearance on the family stage was said by Freud to have, quote, roused violent jealousy, unquote, in little Ernst. In other words, Heinerli appeared and Ernst met him, wishing for his disappearance. In post-war Germany, Sophie Halberstadt became pregnant with her third child, but during the pregnancy contracted the Spanish flu and developed pneumonia. On January 25, 1920, Sophie Halberstadt died suddenly at the tender age of 27, leaving Ernst and Heinerli alone with Max. Years before, Ernst lost his mother each time she left the apartment, lost her a little more when his father came home from the war front, lost another piece of her when Heinerli was born, and then lost her altogether when she died, and he was not yet 6 years old. Following Sophie's death, Anna Freud, 25 years old at the time, became more involved in the care of Ernst and Heinerli in Hamburg and spent vacations with them. Anna provided the boys with analytically informed crisis interventions following the death of their mother, but Ernst's therapy soon transformed into a real psychoanalysis. He was Anna Freud's first patient. And her form of child analysis, as distinguished from Melanie Klein's, is best understood in the light of her early work with Ernst. Meanwhile, Anna Freud was always trying to find some way to address Ernst's needs for a mother and her own need for a child. In 1921, she asked her father if she could bring Ernst home to live with them in Berggasse 19, the Freud family home. In a sense, she asked her father if she could have a child. And Freud, in essence, said, "No, we have to think of your mother." Martha Freud was by then elderly and not able to keep up with a young child. But Ernst's needs were ongoing, and Anna Freud was persistent and creative. Ernst's brother Heinerli was a sickly but bright and engaging little boy who more easily than Ernst captured the interest of others, including their grandpa Sigmund. Consequently, Anna focused her attentions on Ernst, who was far more troubled and frankly unpleasant to be with. In her first efforts at child analysis, she talked with the 6-year-old Ernst about the ideas of where babies come from, the meaning of death, and much more. In 1921, Ernst was in analysis with his Aunt Anna, while she was in analysis on her father's couch, and no doubt also bringing the analysis of Ernst to her father for supervision. Heinerli, being so engaging, endeared himself to all whom he met, and soon Sophie's older sister, Matilda Hollitscher, and her husband, Robert, informally adopted him. And Aunt Anna took on the dual role of being a foster mother to Ernst, as well as being his psychoanalyst on extended visits and vacations together. His analysis with his Aunt Anna was a well-kept secret throughout his life, but Ernst was happy to have the secret revealed, provided that I not reveal it until after his death. A well-known photograph of Ernst, Heinerli, and Grandpa Sigmund was taken in 1922, and the following year, in the spring of 1923, Heinerli, whose birth had roused violent jealousy in little Ernst, developed miliary tuberculosis and died. It was a devastating loss for everyone. Freud suffered bitterly the loss of his beloved Heinerli, but Ernst just went silent. It seemed his murderous wishes had magically disappeared, the object of his sibling rivalry. By his own estimation, Ernst's childhood was difficult. By the age of 9, he had lost his mother, his unborn sibling, his brother Heinerli, and his brother Heinerli. Furthermore, there were multiple disruptions in his education. He was a daydreamer who didn't do so well in an ordinary kind of school, and as a result, went from one school to the next. He described his father as a kind and well-intentioned man, decent, honest, and industrious. But Ernest and his father did not get along well at all. In 1923, Ernest was placed in a small school where he promptly fell in love with one of the teaching assistants, Bertha Katzenstein. His father hired her to be Ernst's nanny and then married her on November 20th, 1923. Ernst described this as his second Oedipal trauma, that between his father, his stepmother, and himself. Soon he was at odds with both his father and his stepmother. From that point on, Ernst did whatever he could to spend as much time as possible in Vienna with the Freud side of the family. In 1925, his half-sister Eva was born, but the age difference and the fact that Ernst spent all of his vacations with the Freuds meant that they scarcely knew each other growing up. When Ernst entered early adolescence, he was terribly troubled. And he was a terribly troubled and lonely boy who consoled himself by playing a game in which he tied a string to a wooden reel, attached a hook to the reel, and lowered it into the apartment house refuse heap where he fished for treasures in a modified adolescent version of Ph.D, about which he did not know as an adolescent. In 1928, Anna arranged for Ernst to move to Vienna, where he lived in the home of Eva Rosenfeld and attended the famous Hitzing School. This is Eva Rosenfeld here, and her son Victor. The school was initiated by Dorothy Burlingham, located in the home of Eva Rosenfeld, and was under the educational guidance of Anna Freud. Their main teachers were the young Peter Bloss and Erik Erikson. In Vienna, Ernst also resumed his analysis with his Aunt Anna, but this time on the couch. Ernst was 14 when he entered what he called his third Oedipal trauma, involving his Grandpa Sigmund, Aunt Anna, and himself. Erik Erikson's second published article, The Fate of the Drives in School Compositions, 1931, was based on his work at the Hitzing School, and one of the compositions described, I have reason to suspect, was written by Ernst, and most likely related to Ernst's conflict with his grandfather, whom he loved dearly, but resented greatly, because he was always so busy seeing patients and studying. His grandfather, it seems, only had time for Ernst on vacations when they would take walks together, hunt for fossils, observe nature, and collect wild mushrooms and berries. In his last year at the Hitzing School, Ernst lived with the Burlingham children upstairs from his grandfather at Berggasse 19. The Burlingham children, this would be Dorothy Burlingham's 4 children. After the Hitzing School, that's a picture of children at the Hitzing School. The man at the far end, not the one that's standing there with that sort of mustache and hat, but the next one over, sitting on this trolley, that's Erik Erikson. And in the middle here, we see Ernst right here. After the Hitzing School closed in 1931, Ernst went to a private school in Germany. But Germany fell increasingly under the spell of Nazism, and in April 1933, at the time of the boycott of Jewish businesses, Ernst left Germany with Eva and Victor Rosenfeld and returned to Vienna, where he finished his high school education in a state school. It was there that he met his lifelong friend, Leopold Bellack. In 1935, Ernst graduated from high school. He was 21 years old and more than a little lost and not knowing what he wanted to do. In 1936, Ernst went to Palestine for 6 months, during which he worked on a kibbutz, traveled, and visited friends of the family like Arnold Zweig and Max Eitingen. The hope was that Ernst might like Israel and decide to settle there. But he did not speak Hebrew, he was not a religious Jew, so he left Palestine when his visa ran out. He returned to Vienna briefly, but then, captivated by the promise of the Russian Revolution, went off on a tour of Moscow in August 1936, full of hope. When he arrived, the terrors of Joseph Stalin's dictatorship were well underway, and the mood of the people was so dreadful, he got out as soon as he could. In 1936, Ernst's father emigrated to South Africa with his second wife and Ernst's half-sister. Max had wanted Ernst to join them, but Ernst didn't get along well with his father and much less with his stepmother. He stayed in Vienna and apprenticed with a portrait photographer named Trudy Fleischmann for 2 years. On March 11, 1938, Ernst's 24th birthday, the Nazis stormed into Vienna, greeted by cheering crowds who began to physically attack Jewish citizens in public. The next day, Austria was absorbed into Germany, and the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society was dissolved. On March 14th, Adolf Hitler arrived in Vienna to more cheering crowds. The next day, the Gestapo raided the Freud home. On March 22nd, Anna Freud was interrogated by the Gestapo. And on March 28th, Ernst left Vienna for Paris, where he stayed for a few days at the home of Marie Bonaparte. He then boarded the train again for the last leg of his trip to London. Ernst was able to go to London because he was one of the 16 people in the Freud party that Ernst Jones was able to get out of Vienna and into England. Ernst arrived safely in London on April 1st, 1938. Sigmund, Martha, Anna, and Anna Freud all reached London 2 months later, on June 6th, 1938. So you see, things were really happening very, very fast, as these things tend to do. When the regime moved in, boom, all of a sudden, they put the Nazis in charge at the train station, they put them in charge at the borders, and suddenly everyone was trapped. You had to pay taxes until you had no money left, and then you were left to die, or you emigrate to another country without a penny in your pocket. But fortunately, the Freud family was able to get through. It's not fair to call it an escape, but it wasn't exactly an emigration either. They had to manage their emigration very carefully, because at any moment they could have just been sent off to Dachau. Sigmund Freud had been suffering cancer of the jaw for 16 years. He was old and frail. On September 23rd, 1939, the 83-year-old Sigmund Freud died in freedom at his home at 20 Maresfield Gardens in London, just as the Second World War was beginning. Ernst worked for a time at Technicolor, carrying huge reels of film from here to there. He volunteered for military service, but was turned down due to his history of pulmonary problems as a child. In July of 1940, a month after the battle at Dunkirk, the German invasion of the Channel Islands, Ernst, along with other A-class aliens, that is, German citizens in England during the time of war, was interned on the Isle of Man, where he remained for the next 14 months, and met there another lifelong friend, Hans Walter Lange. One of the things that, I hope you get the feeling of here is this incredibly difficult life where he is being hit with one massive traumatic experience after another. So by the age of 21, he's not done well in school. He's lost his mother, he's lost his brother, he's lost the unborn child that his mother was carrying when she died. His father has left. He couldn't find a place in Palestine. He couldn't find a place in Soviet Union. And now, he's just sort of banging around, and then as he said, a nice friendly Bobby knocked on the door and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Freud, I'm sorry to disturb you, but in a week we are going to be putting you in an internment camp." And so he went off for 14 months in the camp there. Before and after internment, Ernst had a series of unsatisfactory relationships with young women. He had lost his mother, an unborn sibling, and later lost his brother Heinerli. He'd escaped the Nazis in 1933, fled the gloom of Stalin's Russia in 1936. He had a miserable relationship with his father and stepmother who left for South Africa. He escaped the Nazis again in 1938, lost his grandpa Sigmund in 1939, and had been in an internment camp for friendly aliens for 14 months in the first part of the war. After release from internment, he was desperately unemployed and terribly lonely, and the war was just getting started. During the war, Anna Freud and Dorothy Burlingham established several war nurseries in which they not only provided care to bombed-out children and their families, but also used these sites to continue their scientific investigations. Ernst worked at one of the nurseries as a fire watcher, standing lookout for incoming rocket bombs from the German attacks on London. This was the time of the V-2 rocket bombs. V-1 and V-2 rocket bombs. He later got a job helping to edit an educational magazine called The New Era, and later still did clerical work for the National Dock Labor Board. Toward the end of the war, Ernst became a member of the Home Guard, providing services to the country in place of military personnel so that soldiers could be freed up to focus on combat duties. He also took up with a very motherly young woman named Irene Chambers, with whom he finally found pleasure and stability. The war ended in April 1945, and on the following December 21st, Ernst and Irene were married. Interestingly enough, Irene had lost her mother and a younger sibling in childhood. She said they didn't know this about each other when they met. It came up sometime later, but she says she felt like there was some sort of resonance between the two of them, that they both had this common horrible losses, the loss of a mother and a younger sibling. After the war, Ernst went to Birkbeck College at the University of London, where he studied academic psychology. He graduated in 1949 and then studied psychological testing for a time at Maudsley Hospital. From 1950 to 1953, he worked as a psychosocial nurse at the Castle Hospital, where he dealt with the psychological needs of the mental patients in the hospital under the direction of Dr. Thomas Maine, a psychoanalytically sophisticated psychiatrist whom Ernst admired greatly. Dr. Tom Maine was a very distinguished man. He's very well known within his circles, but not outside them because he didn't write very much. But he was a highly respected hospital administrator who, in addition to being a psychiatrist, he was also a psychoanalyst. In 1949, Ernst entered the London Institute of Psychoanalysis and trained in adult and child psychoanalysis. The Anna Freud Melanie Klein controversies took place during the early 1940s, but Ernst said the tensions were far higher during his training, as there was no forum to really deal with the differences. Only a lot of free-floating hostility. When Ernest started his training, he naturally sided with the Anna Freud track of the training program, but he had plenty of opportunities to participate in seminars led by others such as Melanie Klein, Donald Winnicott, Herbert Rosenfeld, Marion Milner, Clifford Scott, Roger Money Curl, and Michael Baylant. Ernst saw patients at the Institute Clinic, was analyzed by Willy Hoffer, and in 1951 he changed his name from Ernst Wolfgang Halberstadt to W. Ernest Freud. Here we see Willy Hoffer, his analyst. Ernst established his private practice in psychoanalysis in 1953. During the early years, his resources were meager, and so he and Irene postponed having children until he was financially on more solid ground. Meanwhile, he encouraged his wife, Irene, to go to Birkbeck College at London University and then to take her training to become a child analyst at the Hampstead Clinic, which she did. Then, on July 26, 1956, Irene gave birth to their son, Colin Peter Freud. Colin was a happy boy in a happy family, and Anna Freud was a proud and loving great aunt. Ernst had been hoping for a girl, but soon fell in love with this baby boy and became well known in their neighborhood as the father that prammed his baby. They wanted more children, but Irene had developed a thrombosis in her leg during pregnancy and was told that if she had another child, she might die. She and Ernest had both lost their mothers in childhood and didn't want the same to happen to Colin, so they decided against having any more children. Though Ernst Freud was trained in adult and child analysis, his private practice was comprised entirely of adults. Nonetheless, his involvement at the Hampstead Clinic continued for many years, where he saw patients and worked with Anna Freud and others on a number of personality assessment tools. Irene trained to be a child analyst at the Hampstead Clinic and worked there with Ernest in the Well Baby Clinic. Curiously, after Colin was about 5 or 6, the warm relationship between Ernest and Colin cooled and became stormy in later years. Ernst was quite frankly disturbed in childhood. He had a difficult adolescence and a problematic entry into adulthood. Throughout the rest of his life, he was shy, quiet, highly sensitive, somatically preoccupied, withdrawn, and prone to crushing self-doubts and grandiose fantasies. Then add to all that the fact that as Freud's grandson, people expected him to be a genius, and he wasn't. Consequently, he caught a lot of jealousy, whether real or imagined, and suffered from this greatly. But Ernst found relief and creativity in the sublimation of his conflicts through his work as an analyst, his correspondence with dear friends, and his research on infant observations. His interest in babies went back to his interest in his mother's pregnancy with Heinerli. His thoughts and feelings about his unborn sibling that died in utero when his mother died. His Aunt Anna's work with children and babies, and Willy Hoffer's work as an infant observer at the war nurseries. But beyond all this was the background investigative climate of London at that time, which was to a very great extent focused on infant observation, as evidenced by the work of Melanie Klein, Anna Freud, Donald Winnicott, Willy Hoffer, John Bowlby, and the rest. There was just an awful lot of child observation going on, exciting research, and a great deal of cross-fertilization. And why was it such a captivating area of interest? Well, for two reasons, I would say. One, it was a way of further exploring firsthand the psychoanalytic ideas about infancy. And two, it was a way to try to come to terms with the different views of infancy proposed by Melanie Klein and Anna Freud. Now that's my speculation. I'm sure they were all just doing their research and doing their work. But I think it's very interesting that they had, Melanie Klein's group and Anna Freud's group, they had very different ideas about what was happening with infancy and the development of the various aspects of the personality, the development of the ego and the superego and the management of the drives. And of course, Klein sort of telescoped everything, collapsed all the stages into the first 6 months or at least the first year, whereas Anna Freud and her group, following the work of Sigmund Freud, had a larger, a more spread out development. This, to my mind, is much more easily observable in child behavior. But Melanie Klein and her group, they were looking at something different. I would say that the Anna Freudians could see what the Kleinians could see, and the Kleinians could see what the Anna Freudians could see, but they described it very differently. And most specifically, the Kleinians were talking about this unconscious fantasy. And I think what they were dealing with there was making interpretations about instinctual behaviors that they were projecting some of their own ideas about. So that they were saying, okay, well, this must be, you know, the child's desire to eat the mother in this way, that way. The child hasn't said anything, hasn't drawn anything, hasn't played anything. But there was this interpretation of behavior in relation to the instincts and the elaboration of those interpretations based on analyses of older children and quite frequently psychotic children. Melanie Klein said that the superego had emerged in infancy. The small child is capable of forming a transference in analysis, and the infant has elaborate fantasies of the mother's body and the father's body. Anna Freud disagreed, saying the superego emerges much later in accordance with her father's assertion. She said the child does not form a transference the way an adult does, and the infant's symbolic function is not sufficiently developed to create the elaborate fantasies Melanie Klein ascribed to it at such an early age. So how were they to settle their differences? The controversies had already taken place and failed miserably in the 1940s, and the institute training had been split in two. There was only one thing left to do: observe infants and see if their observations would confirm or disconfirm the divergent views that the Freudians and Kleinians had to offer. W. Ernest Freud became a training analyst at the Hampstead Clinic, as well as at the Institute of Psychoanalysis at the British Psychoanalytic Society. He taught mother-infant observation for several years at both institutions. He was a chairman of the Well Baby Research Group at the Hampstead Clinic's Well Baby Clinic, where he took a special interest in the psychology of babies and infant development. Working closely with his Aunt Anna, his friend and colleague Umberto Nájera, and others at the Hampstead Clinic, he studied the metapsychological assessment of personality in the context of the diagnostic profiles. These diagnostic profiles were not psychological tests, but rather a way of organizing clinical data in relation to psychoanalytic metapsychology. Ernst said the real reason for creating the diagnostic profile was that Anna Freud was annoyed with hearing cases that presented the material skewed toward the ego one day and skewed toward the id the next. One could easily imagine she was annoyed with the Kleinian emphasis on the id, the instincts, and the unconscious fantasies to the exclusion of the child's ego and day-to-day problems. Anna Freud always advocating for a clinical position equidistant from the id, the ego, and the superego. The diagnostic profile was intended to help the clinician or researcher organize clinical material in a way that addressed all aspects of the patient's psyche. In 1965, Ernst co-authored his first article with his Aunt Anna and Umberto Nájera. It was entitled Metapsychological Assessment of the Adult Personality, the Adult Profile. In 1967, Ernst's area of expertise became clearly defined, and for the next 30 years he wrote numerous articles on infant observation, the baby diagnostic profile, mother-baby bonding, and most specifically, the psychological aspects of neonatal intensive care. Ernst's favorite story from adolescence to the end of his days was Rip Van Winkle, the story of a man whose world disappears in sleep and when he awakens 20 years later, returns to find the world similar but changed. Throughout adulthood, Ernst played disappearance and return in Vacation After Vacation, revisiting Vienna and all the vacation spots of his childhood to share them with his friends and young family, remembering his grandfather and grandmother, Paula Fichtel, Anna Freud, Dorothy Burlingham, the Burlingham children, and the rest of the extended family. By the 1980s, Ernst's relationship with his wife and son were showing deep signs of strain. Colin was a very bright and very athletic young man whose interests included archaeology and bicycle riding. But when archaeology proved to be not very lucrative, he focused on making custom bicycles and doing bicycle repair. Though painful for both, the relationship between Ernst and Colin remained quarrelsome. In 1982, Anna Freud died. She had been Ernst's aunt, his foster mother, his analyst in middle childhood, his analyst in adolescence, and his psychoanalytic mentor. The following year, in 1983, Ernst and Irene were divorced. After his relationship with his wife ended, Ernst began a relationship with a German woman, Gisela, with whom he enjoyed traveling and spending time together. Ernst moved to Germany near Cologne in 1983, where he resumed his clinical practice and worked for a time at the University of Cologne, conducting brief classical psychoanalyses with psychology and psychiatry students who were studying in Dr. Wilhelm Salber's Psychology Institute. In 1987, Ernst and Irene's only son, Colin Peter Freud, died in a tragic accident while riding a custom-made sport tricycle. With Colin's death, a lifetime of losses came crashing down, one on top of the other. But Ernest carried on, and in 1992, he received an honorary doctorate of philosophy from the University of Cologne in recognition of his work on the metapsychological personality profiles, his studies of the psychological aspects of neonatal intensive care, and his work in brief classical psychoanalysis. In 1994, the intimate relationship between Ernest and Gisela was over, but they remained close and dear friends for the rest of his life. In 1996, Ernst moved back to England and lived in the town of Burnley, where his ex-wife, Irene, was living. He stayed there for 2 years before he became restless again and moved back to Germany, this time to Heidelberg. Though no longer physically well, and in his final years, in his final years he enjoyed visits of friends, kept notes on his aging process, and maintained his extensive correspondence with friends and colleagues all around the world. In 2001, he asked me if I would like to write his biography, and when I agreed, he collaborated fully with the project for as long as he was able. He also worked enthusiastically with his friend and colleague, Dr. Hans von Lübke, to assemble the selected papers of W. Ernest Freud in German. It was published in 2003. Ernst had intended to write his autobiography and also compile his collected papers, but when he saw he no longer had the resources to do it himself, he found others to help him and described it in the Fort-da metaphor of unspooling. You know, when in the Fort-da you throw the spool out and you bring it back, and he said in old age he was unspooling. All he could do was throw it out, and hopefully it would land in the hand of a colleague, as it did with Hans von Lübke and with his biography, he unspooled to me. Unspooling for Ernest was throwing the spool, and when unable to bring it back, letting others pick it up for him. W. Ernest Freud died on September 30th, 2008, at the age of 94. He was Freud's oldest grandchild and Freud's only grandchild to become a psychoanalyst. He was the subject of his grandfather's child observation, his Aunt Anna's first analytic patient, a high school student of Peter Bloss and Erik Erikson, a psychoanalyst, a training analyst, a psychoanalytic researcher and writer, and in many other ways fully involved with psychoanalysis during his entire lifetime. He was born well within the era of Sigmund Freud and became a part of psychoanalysis through his grandfather's ever-observant eyes. With Ernst's death, the last thread connecting us to that era is broken, and now he and it are fort, gone. This is a picture I found in one of Ernst's photo albums, and it's quite clearly a picture of, I think this is actually not at 18 months, it's probably more like 2 years or 2.5 years. And you can see there the spool in his hand. There was another picture that his father had taken. These, his father was a photographer, so this was one of those rare families in the 1910s and 1920s that had lots of photographs. Most people didn't have any photographs at that time. But this family had photographs, and there's one picture, and it was just before Sigmund Freud was coming to visit, because I could see the dates. And it was a picture of Sophie feeding little Ernest, and the next one was a picture of Ernest sitting on the chamber pot. So you could see that Max Halberstadt knew who he was going to be showing the pictures to when his father-in-law was to come. That's the end of my formal presentation. Do you want to have questions?